You want to know what's actually wrong with the world right now? There's a lot of millennials and other people too, younger and older, trying to figure out why there is more stress in today's society and more depression than there really has been ever. And it's an interesting thing to consider. And so everyone's looking back to like the 1950s. These people that are considering, like, well, why are we so more unhappy now than we were then? And the thing that I find is interesting about making those comparisons is because they weren't all that happy then. They really weren't. People in the 1950s were not super happy. They put on a show of happiness, but they weren't truly happy. Alcoholism was significant then, you know, and the children of the 1950s became those who escaped through drugs in the 1960s and 70s, who became hippies. So it's not very smart to look at the 1950s as a template for how people should live, because, well, people really tried to escape from that way of living in the next couple of generations, next couple of decades. So it's like, okay, so if we're not making a good comparison to the 1950s, then where should we go? Well, further back. The trouble is, we had the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution changed the way that we live. People didn't used to work in factories before the Industrial Revolution because there weren't any factories. Not in the way that they became for, you know, there was no assembly lines. There just was none of that kind of stuff. And so were people really happy in the Industrial Revolution, the late 1800s? Working in the Triangle Shirt Factory, which caught on fire and tons of people died? No, they didn't. What they did is they weren't happy, and so they started forming unions to appeal to have more power, to appeal to those who were in charge, the owners of the factories. And so those people weren't very happy. Okay, so let's go further back. Well, if we go further back, we end up with the early 1800s, before the Industrial Revolution, the late 1700s. Were things really great? Well, not so much, because we were really upset. You know, in 1776 we declared independence from Britain. Were we happy then? No. Fucking miserable, because we didn't like paying these taxes to someone who wasn't around. To no taxation without representation. We didn't like that. So we weren't happy. We wanted to make our own rules. Excuse me. Which, in other words, as a country we wanted to make our own rules, which really was, we didn't want to have any rules at all. And so we declared independence and therefore freedom, and then we tried to create a government that didn't restrict on freedom. And right now, there are more laws today governing what you can and cannot do than there were when this country established freedom. There are more laws today governing what you can and cannot do than there were on people when England was in charge of the Americas. Let that sink in for a little bit. There are more laws today governing what you can and can't do than there were on people who declared independence and started a freaking revolutionary war for freedom. That's kind of disturbing. So, we have to go back further. Okay, well, what happened before then? Well, before then, in America at least, before independence, before people started really complaining about Britain's heavy hand in things, the Puritans came over here and started creating settlements. Jamestown, Boston, well, Plymouth, but same thing, right in the Boston area. And were they happy? Not really. The Indians kept attacking them because they were shitty to the Indians, the Native Americans, and things weren't really great. And there was also, you know, they built these fortifications around their cities, these big log walls, garrisons, where their whole little village was inside a giant wall. Were they super happy? No, they weren't. Okay, let's go back further. the Renaissance period. Wait, no, that's not right. That's way later. Okay, the Middle Ages. Were people super happy? Well, hard to say. Hard to say because we don't have a lot of information on the quality of life back then. We have some writings, we have some things, and then the further you go back in history, the less we have information on. So what happens when we go before any recorded history? How did people live? Well, they lived in tribes, and they lived in herds, essentially. So there's little nomadic groups that traveled around before even the advent of farming. They walked around gathering nuts and berries and eating food. I think that was probably when people were the happiest. And I say that because one of the things that people complain about, and one of the things that leads to depression, is a lack of community. So what ended up happening is people created churches, religions, and then all their people in their community, it gave them a reason to get together and to hang out and to spend time together. And they talked about their superstitions, and they read their scriptures, which were just fairy tales written down about fantastical stories, like people walking on water, like people flying. You know, these stories that are scriptural stories are very much reminiscent of Marvel movies, comic books. It's the same kind of genre where you have people that are doing miraculous, impossible things that defy science, that defy the way that the world works. These magical, mysterious things where people have special superpowers. That's what the scripture stories talk about. People being able to control the weather and to call down fire and make things burn up. Be able to talk to gods and all this stuff. But before that all happened, people were just doing their thing. They were happy. They were living as a group, trying not to die, and wandering around. And so if we want to figure out how people are supposed to live, what the best way for people is to not be depressed and to not be sad, I think we have to go back a lot further than the 1950s, a lot further than the Industrial Revolution, and a lot further than the Renaissance or the Egyptian Empire. We have to go back to a place before there were rich people in charge. In Egypt, we had rich people in charge, the pharaohs and their families. And because they had money, they had power. And because they had power, they had slaves. And because they had slaves, they did what they want. And because they had power, they didn't have anyone keeping them accountable for anything. And that applies to the Roman Empire as well. The Romans were in charge. They didn't have anyone holding them accountable. They did whatever they wanted. They had people fight each other to the death for sport because it was fun, because they were bored. How was quality of life back then? Well, not so very good if you were a gladiator fighting to the death. So, if you want to really figure it out and look back to when people were actually happy and had things figured out, you have to go back to a time before rich people were in charge, before there were cultures created around marketing. The only reason why women shave their legs is because, and armpits, is because in the early 1900s they wanted to sell more razors, and so they did a marketing campaign that made it appeal to women in America, because that's where it caught on. It was an American company. That it was gross to not shave, to have hair. It was gross. And that's it. It was a marketing campaign. And it totally changed the culture. And then people were, oh gosh, I can't have hair anywhere. Women at least. It was uncouth, unacceptable. And so they changed it. and they started shaving everything, and they sold a lot more razors, tell you what. But that's just one way that market influence has changed the culture and what is acceptable. And so you have to, if you want to get to cure depression, well, you're never going to cure it because it's just a part of the human experience. We're going to get depressed when things are sad. It's that simple. It's not a bad thing. Okay? It's saying that being sad is a bad thing is the same thing on the opposite end of the spectrum as saying being happy is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing that is part of life. What is a bad thing is being stuck in one state. Either super happy all the time, because then you're not feeling all the feelings in the range of the human experience, or you're feeling sad all the time, then you're not feeling all the feelings in the range of the human experience. So, if you want to really be happy, then you have to accept yourself as you are. Guess what the people did before the Industrial Revolution, before governments took over, before rich people had power, before we lived in cities and we marketed things to each other with money? People were fine with their physical appearance. It was what it was. We weren't concerned with mirrors and making our appearance look really good. We were just alive. And so we didn't have the stress of needing to conform to certain social norms of cutting hair that grows naturally. Like, what the hell? So your body grows hair. That's okay. It's supposed to. If it happens naturally on your body and it isn't cancer growing, then it's natural and it's fine. Hair is fine on a man or a woman. It's just the people who sold razors who said that that wasn't okay. So, oh shoot, I'm over 12 minutes. Well, I'll sign off right there. But just remember that what really matters is not what you're stressing about.